So we can say that I don't know. We can say a lot of things, but one of the things that comes to mind is that ultimately, if the goal of the self is to become itself, to be what it really is, and if the way that that's been cast in this book is to get out of despair, and if despair is sin, then ultimately the goal of the self is to get out of a state of sinfulness, to not sin. So what does it mean to not sin? One of the themes that Kierkegaard is really stressing here is the nature of sin, and the fact that sin is not simply, again, doing something bad. Sin is doing something that God doesn't want. So the opposite of sin is not doing something good. One of the things he points out is that outwardly, at least, you could live a life of complete respectability and an ethical life, but it would still be a life, possibly, could still be a life of sin and despair. He says at the top of page 114, it is so easily forgotten that everything, speaking humanly, can be more or less as it should be in these respects. And he's thinking about bad things like murder, stealing, fornication, etc., Ten Commandment type stuff. That everything, speaking humanly, can be more or less as it should be in these respects, and yet the whole life be sin, that notorious kind of sin, the splendid vices, a willfulness which either spiritlessly or shamelessly remains or wants to be in ignorance of in how infinitely far deeper a sense a human self is under an obligation to obey God. In its every secret desire and thought, in its readiness to grasp and willingness to follow every slightest hint from God as to what is His will with this self, that is what sin would not be, is looking, what does God want, doing what God wants. Sins of the flesh are the willfulness of the lower self. That sounds very Platonic, right? And what was injustice but the desires overcoming reason, the lower self, the flesh, getting what it wants. Sins of the flesh are the willfulness of the lower self, but how often is one devil not driven out with the devil's own help, and the final condition not worse than the first? That is, one can control the desires, the flesh, and still be in a state of sin, because the flesh can't sin. Right? Sin is a condition of spirit, and spirit is free. The flesh is not free. He says in the next paragraph on page 114, that sin is despair, since sin is not the unruliness of flesh and blood in itself, but the spirit's consent to it. That is, sin doesn't consist in the flesh overcoming me, or the desires overcoming me. That's a cop-out, frankly, I think, from Kierkegaard's point of view. Sin consists in the spirit's consent to be overwhelmed by the flesh. He believes that we are free, and that our nature as human beings, part of which is that we have desires, as Plato fully recognized, is no excuse, because we are fundamentally free beings. So what does it mean to get out of sin? What is required to get out of sin? Again, it's not just doing something good, because you can do good things, live a good life, and still be in a state of sin and despair. That's very Christian, I believe, very Christian thought, and that is that one remembers that however strong an ethical component Christianity has, it has never, to my mind, claimed that people who aren't Christians can't live good lives. That would frankly be absurd. It just would fly in the face of everything that we know about history and other cultures. People who are not Christians can live very good lives, no doubt about it. The problem from the Christian point of view is that they can live good lives, but they can't be saved. And so I think that's true of a certain form of Christianity, at least. That is, the object of life is not to live a good life. It can't be, because one can live a good life and still be in despair, still not be saved. The object of life is this life, I guess, is to be saved. And what is required of that, if not living a good life? It is something else. He says, again, in the next to last paragraph on page 114, the main point here is simply that this definition of sin as always being before God, being disobedience to God, embraces all forms like a net, and that it does, as can also be seen if one tests it against its opposite, the definition of faith, the sure sea mark which I steer by to hold myself on course throughout this whole work. Faith is that the self, in being itself and in wanting to be itself, is grounded transparently in God. But often enough this fact, that the opposite of sin is by no means virtue, has been overlooked. That is, what is the opposite of sin? He says at the top of page 115, no, the opposite of sin is faith. So, if, as he indicates in that passage, this is the mark that he's steering by in the whole work, we had better pay pretty close attention to it if we want to understand him. And excuse me while I sin, have another cigarette. The opposite of sin is not virtue, it's faith. And again, if this is so important, then really the whole book is leading up towards this, the requirement of faith. So if that's what's required of us, we selves, is faith, some interesting questions now emerge here. What exactly does he mean by faith? What does it mean to have faith in God? Because remember, the self, which at this point is in the deepest form of despair, the most dangerous form of despair, the despair of sin before God, is fully aware of God's presence, that God exists. That's not a question. So it's not faith in the simple existence of God. Faith must mean something else, which really, begs the question: what does God really require of us? Or maybe what do we require of God? Or to have faith.